and overthrowing the social order in a sense. So when members of that working class get out of line, they get arrested, they get tried, imprisoned, maybe in the criminal justice system. How often do we tend to see those within extreme amounts of power and wealth end up getting a judgment day right off the bat versus somebody that's maybe coming from a working class? Like if I were to ever be committed of a crime, right? I'm not going to necessarily have access to those means versus somebody that's a billionaire who's going to be able to call up somebody on speed dial and say, hey, I need out of this because this happened. So we have to remember that when we're looking at the conflict perspective, how easily deterrent that stuff can be based because of that conflict happening between the wealthy versus those that don't have that power in hand. Finally, I want to talk about the reactions to deviance, right? We know that imprisonment tends to follow a degraduation ceremony, right? Think about it from the sense. There is a degraduation ceremony that exists. A lot of times you're going to have that public trial, that pronouncement that person's unfit to live among law-abiding people, right? You're going to be in court. They're going to throw the book at somebody, right? And it's an increasingly popular reaction to crime. But it fails necessarily to teach inmates to stay away from crime, right? So people end up in jail or prison. And what we've seen is that the United States has the dubious distinction of having not only more prisoners than any other nation, but also has a larger percentage of its population in prison, right? So when we look at statistics like this, we can begin to see that is slowly on the rise. From 1970 to where we are, we have seen spikes of numbers where there are an astounding number of people that are imprisoned within our system. Look at it from the age perspective, right? We know that the prison inmate system is slowly growing. So what does it look like from the age perspective? We're seeing higher numbers of those 25 to 34 within prison, as well as 45 to 54. Really high numbers when you look at it. African Americans are also disproportionately represented among that prison population, and this can sort of go back to the race component of it. We'll start to see that there are slightly higher numbers for certain groups that can be found within certain prisons versus county jail population. So it's sort of interesting when we begin to look at that dichotomy and that relationship that exists amongst those statistics. For about the past 20 years, the United States has had this get tough policy. There's this 3 strikes and you're out laws that have become very common. Unfortunately, these laws have had some unintended consequences. So when we begin to look at this stuff, we can start to see that, if somebody had 3 DUIs, all of a sudden they might get the book thrown at them within a court system as a result of that 4th DUI. Versus somebody maybe that committed murder and they're not getting hit as hard for another reason because it was their first offense. You're going to start to see that this 3 strikes and you're out law has become very complex, highly debatable as a result of it, because there are certain gaps within that particular policy that has created some challenging notions for people to understand how to sort of go about it. Here we're looking at the recidivism of crime. So those prisoners that are released from prisons, they're looking at if they are rearrested and there's a recidivism rate. We want to look at why. What did they engage in? You see very high numbers of car theft, burglary, illegal weapons, fraud, illegal drugs, robbery, rape, drunk driving, and murder. So very far and few between, but very interesting statistics when we look at it. And I don't know if you've heard that term recidivism. That recidivism rate is the proportion of persons who are rearrested. That's all that means. When we look at the United States, it is considerably high. For those sentenced to prison for crimes of violence, within 3 years of the release, about 62% are rearrested. and 52% are actually back in prison as a result of that. This is a highly charged topic that we're going to sort of talk about. The death penalty is one of the most extreme and controversial measures that any state can take. A lot of people argue that there are biases in the use of the death penalty. They believe that these reflect regional, gender, social class, as well as racial and ethnic biases. So look at this. When you look at this state map overview, you can begin to see how many executions have been conducted since 1977. Okay, so there are certain states that do not have the death penalty. New York's one of them, West Virginia, the purple states. Now, there are also states with the death penalty that have not executed anyone. Far and few between, New Hampshire and Kansas, but do exist. Now, the rest in the peach color are states with the death penalty. So you can see Pennsylvania has about 3. But when we look at certain ones, you can see like Texas, the highest number of executions, 477. Virginia, 109. Oklahoma, 96. Now, it's an interesting topic because it's so highly charged. There are individuals that have biases that believe that it is an appropriate form of legal control and social control. There's also groups of individuals where we need to begin to take that step back and look at it. Are there biases into who ends up with the death penalty? And what you're going to find is, right, who gets executed. Let's look at the gender component, right? A whopping 99.1% are males versus that 0.9% that are females. Why do you think that is? That's a really interesting conversation because we know that gender has very interesting components attached to it. And I'm sort of intrigued to see who some of you guys have chosen for your your next writing assignment in reference to deviance. What you're going to see is that a lot of times we don't see females from that sense when it comes to the death penalty. Certain groups, juries, tend to have a much more lenient concept with them because they're female, just from that bias. I don't know if anybody's decided on who they're choosing, but Eileen Carroll Lee Warnos